Howdy y'all. Happy Pride Month. Today, we're going to be talking about something in the spirit of the season. The current moral panic and exterminationist campaign conservatives are waging on the existence of LGBTQ people. This may seem like a stretch to claim, but it's really not. In 2023 so far, state legislatures have proposed more than 500 bills targeting transgender people. There was the Don't Say Gay bill I covered on the channel last year, and since then, Ron DeSantis has shaped his entire presidential platform around being a massive bigot. And recently, the right is all about boycotting any brand they perceive as woke, aka supportive of gay people, including a boycott of Bud Light for sending one promotional can to a trans celebrity for a sponsored post, as well as a boycott of Target for selling swimsuits with extra coverage in the crotch region, and a boycott of Chick-fil-A. Did they just get bored? Is the chicken not homophobic enough for them? Well, anyways, the far-right crowd right now is essentially a pool of starving piranhas, ready to shred into any perceived support of queer people. They're seeking to eliminate trans people from public life, and make no secret of the fact they'll be coming for the rest of the community next. The point of this video is not to argue that this is true, cause it's so fucking obvious. What I'm more interested in is the rhetoric backing their attacks on these communities. For how clear it is that Republicans despise gay people, it's relatively rare to hear them say so outright. Rather, they typically fall behind a defense we've seen time and time again. I don't hate the gay community. I just don't want sexuality shown to children. Be whatever you want. Just leave my kids out of it. It's disgusting how the LGBTQ community targets innocent children. Teaching kids about LGBT will confuse them. I have gay friends, but I wouldn't want those disgusting f***s in front of my children. Please, won't somebody think of the children? Children are routinely used as the justification and motivation for actions against the LGBTQ community. Critics of gender-affirming healthcare for transgender individuals often claim they just want to avoid kids making irreversible medical decisions, while pushing for the banning of reversible treatments, as well as trying to outlaw this medicine for everyone, regardless of age. Critics of LGBT representation in media claim that the presence of these depictions will confuse children. Critics of non-standard gender expression, such as drag shows, claim these events are sexualizing children. Critics of the mere notion a child could be LGBTQ claim the same. Whenever they're trashing on gay people, it's always about the kids. But this isn't a new phenomenon. Purporting to protect children is one of the central pillars of reactionary far-right politics. For the most obvious example of this, we can just look at the previous anti-gay campaigns, like the Save Our Children campaign, headed by Anita Bryant, singer, asshole, and professional pie reviewer. This campaign originated in opposition to an anti-discrimination law in Florida, claiming a need to save children from homosexuality, as the law prevented Christian schools from discriminating on the basis of sexuality in the hiring process. The law also outlawed discrimination in the realms of housing and public accommodation, but the angle the Save Our Children coalition went with was the possibility of little Timmy being exposed to a homosexual. And this strategy was carried to success, as the law would wind up being repealed by a 2-to-1 margin. This success would result in pretty much every anti-LGBT push afterwards using the exact same strategy. Opposition to gay rights in the 21st century often centers the issue of gay adoption, claiming it harms children, as well as branding gay people as pedophiles or groomers. And while it's prominent with the anti-LGBTQ crowd, this child-centering rhetoric has been used to an extent in pretty much every discriminatory movement. One of the reasons the Ku Klux Klan was so anti-Catholic was their belief that the Pope brainwashed children through Catholic schools. And following the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, opposition to desegregation of schools would often claim they just cared about the right to keep their kids off buses and in neighborhood schools. I can't possibly understate just how essential the role of children is to the far right. The 14 words, probably the most widespread white supremacist slogan, reads, "We must secure the existence for our people and a future for white children." Their rallying cry is literally, "Think of the children with more racism." By shielding their bigotry under the guise of children's safety, the right achieves a sort of rhetorical switcheroo, where they go from an active force trying to oppress others to just defending against the supposed dangers of a minority group. Not even defending themselves, but rather children, who are often considered helpless. That's how you have people violently attacking trans people, or more realistically, just anyone with a non-standard gender presentation, and somehow thinking they're not the aggressor in the situation. Children are also a good group to claim to be defending, because it's not controversial. Humans tend to be naturally inclined to support protecting kids. In stories, if you want to make a character more sympathetic, it's writing shorthand to give them a kid to look after. So the right will always seek to find a way to center children in any debate. Because if they didn't say they're doing it for the kids, their policies would look even more comically evil. Now, this protecting the children narrative is a very simple, but still quite effective rhetorical technique. The only problem is that it falls apart if you take even a second to analyze what conservatives are actually doing. Cause look at what they're rallying against as a civilization-threatening danger to children. The existence of queer people, a couple kids getting access to hormone blockers, a rainbow shirt at the grocery store. These aren't real issues that harm children on any meaningful level. Meanwhile, they let fall by the wayside so much stuff that actually threatens kids. Backing a platform that seeks to underfund public schools, literally starve children, and screws over the planet they're set to inherit. Essentially every conservative policy harms children to some extent. It's honestly almost impressive. And even setting aside just the general well-being of kids, if your main concern was the sexual abuse of children, which remember, the right is supposedly very concerned about this if years of Pizzagate and groomer panic are to be believed. Why would you spend all your time talking about Pride merch and not address any part of the massive ongoing scandal in the church? Like, I know everyone just kinda knows the church has a problem, but it's not exactly going away, and these supposed defenders of the children seem to have a total blind spot for it. And in some cases, that blind spot is very much intentional. Such as the recent ruling by the conservative Arizona Supreme Court, which ruled that the Mormon Church does not have to report cases of child abuse they learn of, and also does not have to cooperate with any investigations into child abuse. And if we're talking about child abuse, we have to talk about the right's attacks on sex education in schools. It's no secret that conservatives hate any sex ed that goes beyond abstinence preaching. In fact, a lot of the time, they lump sex ed in with all that stuff they consider grooming, considering it a massive affront that children should know anything about their bodies. But the purpose of comprehensive sex ed is not to encourage minors to have sex. A lot of them are going to do that no matter what you teach. Rather, this education gives young people the knowledge they need to be safe, and crucially, the ability to recognize when they are being abused, and the language to express that to others and get help. Comprehensive sex education demonstrably lowers the risk of childhood sexual assault. Actually protecting children from abuse is rejected in favor of preserving some supposed innocence, which really just amounts to kids not understanding their own bodies. Ultimately, these pushes aren't really about protecting children, but rather controlling them. They push for abstinence-only education, not because they think it works, they know it doesn't, but it does control what information their children have access to. Back in the 80s, when rock music and D&D were being branded as driving forces behind child sex abuse and teen suicide, I don't think most people claiming that really believed what they were saying. What they did believe was that they personally didn't want their kids engaging in those hobbies or listening to that music. The ultimate example of this is the right's constant tearing down of public schools and simultaneous praise for private, charter, and particularly homeschooling. You know, the type of school that gives parents seemingly absolute control over literally everything their kid learns. And in all this talk of protecting children from the scary homosexuals, there's one group that goes ignored. You see, gay people don't spontaneously emerge into the world at age 18. And queer youth are arguably the group hit the hardest by these attacks on LGBTQ rights. The push to remove queer representation in children's media, to remove any mentions of queer people from the curriculum, and if that's not achievable, to just take kids out of school altogether, denies queer youth the opportunity to better understand themselves and see themselves represented in a positive manner. More alarmingly is the serious push to brand parents of queer youth as child abusers and have these children taken away from their supportive parents. Many conservatives also push for the continued practice of conversion therapy for queer youth, which is literally just child abuse. Additionally, there's the targeting of transgender and non-binary youth. Previously on the channel, we've covered how trans youth forced to use the wrong bathrooms in school were subject to higher rates of sexual assault and harassment, how attempts to keep trans athletes out of school sports always seem to end up leading to a push for genital inspections of minors, and how bans on trans athletes in school sports other children and deny them the opportunity for a normal social life, and also seem oddly personal, in some instances only targeting a single kid. None of these policies protect kids. The cisgender kids don't benefit, and the transgender kids are harmed. But that still doesn't stop transphobes from using the claim of protecting children to restrict the rights of trans kids. This is most prominent in their opposition to gender-affirming hormone therapy and surgeries for trans youth. Despite the overwhelmingly positive outcomes for trans people who undergo these treatments, experiencing better mental health outcomes and a lowered risk of suicide, opponents will insist that it's too risky, saying they wish to protect children from doing irreversible damage to their bodies, ignoring the fact that for many trans youth, the effects of puberty are far more damaging to their mental well-being. The amount of teens who are even able to access gender-affirming care, let alone surgery, is incredibly low, and the amount who regret it is even lower. These procedures all require informed consent and generally a lot of other hoops to jump through. So if someone manages to actually receive care, it's almost certain they need it. That's not to say there are none who regret it. Detransitioners exist, and in fact, a few public detransitioners are able to make rather stable careers off of telling conservatives how trans people are all evil. But let me put it this way. The amount of people who regret getting gender-affirming surgery is so minute that arguably the most notable public detransitioner isn't even someone who is trans. It's a guy that got surgery to look Korean. Transphobes really have to reach for examples of people who regret receiving gender-affirming care, is what I'm saying. And for all they rail against gender-affirming surgeries, decrying them as irreversible bodily mutilation, which is just a really dickish way to talk about someone, the right is fine with plenty of irreversible surgical procedures performed on children. Okay, look. I don't want to be known as the anti-circumcision crusader, because that's generally a pretty weird manosphere type of crowd to be running with. But circumcision is an example of an irreversible medical procedure performed on a baby who is incapable of consenting to the procedure for purely cultural and aesthetic purposes. In the same vein, you have corrective surgery performed on intersex infants, which seeks to conform their genitalia to a standard deemed normal. These procedures are almost always medically unnecessary, endanger the child, and go against the idea of conformed consent. Once again, for a procedure that is only done for cultural and aesthetic purposes. For a prime example of these mental gymnastics, look at Matt Walsh, a man who's incredibly invested in the genitalia of children. He's made countless videos referring to gender-affirming care as mutilation, and has publicly attacked hospitals who perform these procedures, leading his audience to send bomb threats and death threats to pediatricians. But when making his shitty transphobia documentary, he heavily featured a group of Maasai people to support his conservative patriarchal worldview, ignoring the weird mysticism of treating a contemporary agricultural society like they possess some ancient truth to everything, The trans people mutilate children guy, when seeking to support his views on trans people, goes straight to a culture which is most notable for practicing female genital mutilation. Ultimately, the right's treatment of queer youth betrays their true intentions. If the concern was really that teens would get gender-affirming surgery and feel bad about it, that a kid would see a rainbow flag in a cartoon and be confused, if they're going on this whole crusade just to avoid a single child feeling bad, then why do they force kids into bathrooms where they're more likely to be assaulted? Why do they kick kids off their sports teams? Why do they try to tear queer youth from their parents? Why do they attack everything that might make them feel more comfortable being themselves? Why do they try so hard to reinforce a culture that tells queer youth, "We hate you. You are evil and wrong. The world would be a better place without you in it"? Because homophobia, transphobia, it's never been about protecting the children. Like always, it's about controlling them, enforcing a cis-heteronormative ideal that seeks not just the elimination of LGBTQ youth, but LGBTQ people as a whole. And while we're seeing some victories in holding back these attacks, millions of queer people are still getting hurt in the process. To avoid backsliding on LGBTQ rights will require massive resistance. Don't let them take away your rights. And don't ever let them tell you that they're doing it for the fucking children. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and a special thank you to my patrons who helped me buy new headbands, including my $10 nut patrons, Yearning to Fly. If this video made you sad, and you want a more cheerful take on Pride Month, I made a bonus vid on my second channel where I ranked every episode of The Owl House. If this video fired you up and you want to take action, I'll link some resources in the description. Also, holy moly, I got like 3,000 new subscribers off of the Lolita video. Thank you all so much. That project took over my life for like 5 months straight, and I'm so happy you all liked it. I've got more big projects planned for the future, so I hope you'll stick around. See ya!